It wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary. Just another evening drive through the back roads of Fort Mitchell, where General Cassandra Ellison, an Army officer with over 2 decades of service, would make her way home after a long day. Her Jeep Grand Cherokee, matte black with military-grade specifications, hummed quietly as she navigated the winding roads, her eyes scanning the GPS screen mounted on the dashboard. She wasn't lost, far from it, but the roads were under constant construction, always shifting, always changing. New intersections, new lanes, new signs that popped up overnight, making even the most familiar routes feel like uncharted territory. Cassandra had driven these roads countless times before, yet no matter how many times she passed them, it always felt like she was recalibrating her path, ensuring that she was on track. The military life had taught her to stay adaptable, to stay prepared, and she wasn't about to let something as simple as a detour throw her off course. But as the GPS adjusted, something in her rearview mirror caught her attention. The flashing lights, red and blue, cutting through the stillness of the night, flashing like a warning. In that moment, Cassandra didn't panic. She didn't flinch. She didn't feel fear. She felt something else, something familiar, a deep, weary resignation. She knew exactly what this was, and she knew exactly how this would play out. The sirens blared behind her, loud enough to fill the car, but Cassandra remained calm. Her grip on the steering wheel was steady, her hands at the 10 and 2 position, as they always were. She had been in high-stress situations before, countless missions, tense negotiations, moments where her life was on the line, but this wasn't one of those moments. No, this was something different. This was routine. She had been pulled over before. She had been stopped by law enforcement before. But tonight, something felt off. The air in the car shifted, and she knew something was about to go horribly wrong. As the officer's car pulled up behind hers, the sound of the engine idling like a predator preparing to pounce, Cassandra didn't move. She didn't hurry to roll down her window or fumble for her documents. She knew the drill. There was no need for panic, no need for fear, but she did feel something, an awareness of the weight of this moment, the knowledge that once again she would have to play a role she never wanted to take on, the role of the calm, composed black woman who was about to be treated as anything but. As she waited, her eyes shifted to the side, briefly catching the officer's silhouette as he stepped out of his patrol car. It wasn't fear that struck her, but the cold realization that, despite everything she had achieved, despite her years of service and her rank as a general in the United States Army, none of that mattered here. Not in this moment. She wasn't an officer. She wasn't a leader. She wasn't a decorated veteran. To this officer, she was just another black woman driving alone at night, and that was enough to paint her as a threat. The officer's boots crunched on the asphalt as he made his way toward her vehicle. Cassandra's hands remained at 10 and 2, her posture perfect, her gaze steady, watching his every move. She knew that the slightest mistake could make this situation spiral out of control. The officer came into view, his eyes fixed on her, his stance rigid, almost hostile. Officer Brent Mallory, no older than 30, approached with the kind of energy that felt designed to intimidate. Cassandra noticed immediately that his hand hovered near his holster, a subtle but unmistakable move that told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a routine stop. This wasn't just a simple traffic violation. No. To Officer Mallory, she wasn't just another civilian. She was a threat. As he approached the window, Cassandra's breath remained even, her pulse steady, her mind clear. She wasn't rattled. She had faced enemies on foreign soil, negotiated with world leaders, led troops into dangerous situations. But here, on the side of a road in Georgia, none of that mattered. Not to this officer. To him, she was just another black woman, a potential criminal, and that was the story he was going to tell. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked. His voice was harsh, demanding, but Cassandra didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply kept her hands where they were, her fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel, just as she had been taught, 10 and 2. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of control, the same control she had learned to wield in far more dangerous situations. She wasn't going to make it easy for him to escalate this encounter. Her mind was calm, her body still, her gaze unyielding. The officer was trying to assert dominance, trying to show who was in charge, but Cassandra wasn't about to give him that power. She was not the one out of control, he was. She could already see it in his posture, the way his fingers hovered near his belt. He was ready for something to happen. He was hoping something would happen. But it wasn't going to, not if she could help it. "License and registration," Officer Mallory demanded, his tone still sharp, laced with suspicion. Cassandra exhaled slowly, but there was no panic in her movement. She didn't rush. There was no need to. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her glove compartment, retrieving her documents with the same steady calm she had shown him before. She didn't make eye contact with him, not out of fear, but because she knew the power of the moment. Her every move, every gesture would be scrutinized. One wrong move, one slip-up, and this could escalate into something far worse than it needed to be. She kept her gaze on her hands, making sure every action was slow and controlled, her fingers careful not to make any sudden movements. As Mallory glanced at the documents, Cassandra watched him, her expression unwavering. The officer's eyes flicked between the registration and her face, his suspicion apparent. But as he scanned the paperwork, he didn't acknowledge it. He stepped back slightly, his gaze now shifting from her documents to the vehicle itself, as if he expected to find something hidden. There was nothing there, of course, just a well-maintained Jeep Grand Cherokee, nothing out of the ordinary. But the officer wasn't looking for a reason to let her go. He was looking for a reason to escalate. His fingers lingered near his holster, his posture still tense, as if he was waiting for the smallest excuse to make a move. Cassandra knew exactly what he was doing. She had been in this position before. It didn't matter how clean her record was. It didn't matter how much she had sacrificed in service to this country. To Officer Mallory, she was just another black woman in a car, and that was enough to make her a target. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice now more insistent, more demanding. Cassandra could feel the shift in the air, the tension rising. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. This was something else. The officer's tone had shifted from caution to aggression, from suspicion to accusation. Cassandra turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting his. She wasn't going to let him pull her out of the car like some criminal. She wasn't going to let him treat her like this. "I'm not under arrest," she replied, her voice firm but calm, steady, unshaken. She wasn't giving in. She wasn't going to let him push her into a confrontation. The officer, however, didn't seem interested in listening. His demand came again, more forceful this time. "Step out of the vehicle now." Cassandra's jaw clenched, but she remained composed. She wasn't going to move unless she had to. She knew her rights. She wasn't under arrest. This wasn't a routine traffic stop anymore. It was an attempt to assert control over a situation that should never have been a situation to begin with. Cassandra wasn't going to let him make the first move. In the distance, a few cars had slowed down, their drivers eyeing the scene. A figure in a gray Toyota Camry had started filming with their phone, and Cassandra caught sight of other curious onlookers gathering. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the judgment, the scrutiny. They were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. They had no idea who she was, what she had done, or the sacrifices she had made in her life. To them, she was just another woman pulled over by a police officer. But Cassandra wasn't just another woman. She wasn't just a civilian. She wasn't just a statistic. She was General Cassandra Ellison, and she wasn't about to let this officer or anyone else define her by their assumptions. "Let me make a call," she said, her voice steady but resolute, cutting through the growing tension in the air. The words hung between them for a moment, but Cassandra knew what was coming next. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was asserting her right to make a phone call. The officer's refusal to acknowledge her rank, to treat her with the respect she deserved, would soon come back to haunt him. It wasn't a question now. It was a statement. The officer didn't hesitate to escalate things. Without a moment's hesitation, his tone shifted from tense to outright commanding as he barked, "Step out of the vehicle." His words felt sharp, as though he had already made up his mind about what was happening. Cassandra's jaw clenched, but she kept her posture steady. She wasn't going to give him the reaction he was looking for. There were no quick movements, no panicked scrambling to comply with his demands. Instead, she met his gaze and held it, calm and controlled. She wasn't about to let him pull her out of the car like some criminal, not when she knew she had done nothing wrong. She had nothing to hide, nothing to fear. But this moment wasn't about her or her actions. It was about a power struggle, a contest of control, and the officer had made it clear that he wasn't going to let it go. Cassandra could feel the tension in the air, heavy and thick, almost palpable. She had seen this before, the way people assumed the worst when they saw someone who looked like her. But she wasn't just another person to be treated like an enemy. She wasn't the stereotype the officer had built in his mind. She was General Cassandra Ellison, a woman who had served her country, who had earned the respect of her peers, and who had been trained to handle far more dangerous situations than a simple traffic stop. But to Officer Mallory, she was none of those things. To him, she was just another black woman on the side of the road, and that assumption was enough for him to treat her like a threat. "I'm not under arrest," she said firmly, her voice calm but assertive. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of fact. She wasn't going to get out of the car unless he had a legal reason to make her. She wasn't going to let him push her around. She knew her rights, and she knew that this wasn't just some random interaction. This was about more than just being stopped on the side of the road. It was about the system that saw her as less than who she was, less than what she had earned. But Officer Mallory didn't care. He didn't care about her rank, her history, her accomplishments. He wasn't interested in hearing anything she had to say. He had already decided that this wasn't just a traffic stop. It was something more. His body language told her everything she needed to know. His fingers hovered near his holster, his stance growing more aggressive with every passing second. This was no longer about the law. It was about power. "Step out of the vehicle now," he ordered again, his voice raising slightly, the impatience creeping in. It wasn't just a command anymore. It was a demand, and Cassandra could feel the shift in the air. It was clear now. He wasn't going to let this go. The situation had escalated beyond her control, and she knew the next few moments would determine how far things would spiral. She had been in these situations before, but something about this felt different. The tension, the assumption, the refusal to see her for who she really was, all of it collided in that moment, and she knew the situation was no longer just about her. It was about everything that was wrong with the system that allowed this to happen. But Cassandra wasn't going to make it easy for him. She wasn't going to let him dictate the narrative. She knew if she got out of the car, things could escalate even further. She could feel the eyes of the few onlookers who had gathered, some questioning the officer's behavior, but most just watching, waiting. And then, in the silence of the moment, she spoke again. Her voice didn't waver. It was steady, firm. "No," she said, the words simple but powerful. She wasn't going to be pulled out of the car without cause. She wasn't going to let the officer control the narrative. The silence stretched between them. The officer stood there, his eyes narrowing, his patience clearly wearing thin. But Cassandra held her ground. The officer had made a mistake by treating her this way. Now, it was up to her to turn the situation around, to make sure he understood exactly who he was dealing with. She wasn't just some black woman on the side of the road. She was General Cassandra Ellison, and she wasn't going to let him disrespect her. The officer took a step back, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to someone standing their ground so firmly, especially not someone like her. But Cassandra remained calm. She didn't need to raise her voice or shout to make a point. The strength was in her composure, in her resolve. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to diminish her, but it would be the last time she allowed it to happen without fighting back. As Officer Mallory continued to stand there, his eyes still trained on her, Cassandra could feel the weight of the moment. The onlookers were still watching, their phones out, capturing everything. She didn't know whether it would help or make things worse, but she wasn't going to let fear dictate her next move. She knew what had to be done. She needed to take control, to make sure that this didn't turn into something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer spoke again. This time his voice was laced with frustration. "I said, step out of the vehicle." His words were sharp, insistent. He wasn't backing down, but Cassandra wasn't either. The situation was growing more tense by the second, and she could feel it in her bones. She knew the longer this went on, the worse it would get. But still, she didn't move. She wasn't going to let him win by making her afraid. And that's when it hit her. She needed to take control of this moment. The officer wasn't going to stop, and the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. But Cassandra wasn't going to be the one to escalate it. Not now. Not today. With deliberate calm, Cassandra slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. Her movements were methodical, controlled, almost robotic. She wasn't reacting to the officer's commands. She was responding on her terms. As she opened the door and stepped out of the vehicle, her posture was perfect, her presence commanding. She was still the general. She was still in control. But she knew this wasn't going to end until she made her next move. "Do you have any weapons?" Officer Mallory asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. But Cassandra didn't flinch. She turned slightly to her side, presenting herself in the most open way possible. "No, officer. I'm active duty. My weapons are secured on base." The words were simple, straightforward, but they were enough to make any reasonable officer pause and reconsider. The officer, however, didn't seem to care. He wasn't listening. He wasn't interested in who she was or what she had to say. To him, she was just another black woman he needed to subdue, someone he could control with his authority. "You military?" Mallory sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "What are you, a mechanic?" The words were a slap in the face, a dismissive insult that revealed the officer's true colors. He didn't care who she was. He didn't care about her rank, her service, or her sacrifices. To him, she was just another other. Cassandra didn't respond. There was no point in explaining herself to someone who wasn't willing to listen. She wasn't interested in a fight over who she was. She wasn't interested in justifying herself to someone who had already made up their mind about her. But as the officer continued to circle her vehicle, tapping the flashlight against the glass as if searching for something that wasn't there, Cassandra remained composed. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of losing her cool. She wasn't going to give him the power to turn this moment into a confrontation. She wasn't going to let him control her narrative any longer. It was clear now that the officer wasn't looking for a reason to let her go. He was looking for a reason to escalate things, to make this into something that it shouldn't have been. But Cassandra wasn't going to let him win. She had seen this before. She had been treated this way before. But this time, she wouldn't back down. This time, she would make sure the officer understood exactly who he was dealing with. The game was about to change, and Cassandra was ready to make her next move. Finally, the officer moved closer, reaching for the cuffs at his belt. But Cassandra wasn't going to make this easy for him. She stood tall, her back straight, her hands still at her sides. As Officer Mallory made his move to restrain her, she didn't resist. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just stood there, knowing that this moment of injustice, was about to be something much bigger than either of them could anticipate. As Officer Mallory moved in to place the cuffs around her wrists, Cassandra stood still. She wasn't going to resist. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of struggling, of escalating the situation further. But the act of placing those cuffs on her, the symbol of her loss of freedom, her dignity stripped away by an officer who hadn't even begun to understand who she was, wasn't something she could easily accept. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into her wrists, but she didn't flinch. She had faced worse in her life, much worse than this. But in that moment, the officer wasn't just handcuffing a woman. He was handcuffing a general, a decorated officer who had served this country with honor, and he was doing it out of ignorance, out of an assumption that she was a threat simply because of the color of her skin. The weight of it all pressed down on her as she stood there, her posture perfect, her body stiff but resolute. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She wasn't going to let Officer Mallory think he had won. There was a crowd now, some watching in silence, others speaking in hushed tones, asking why she was being stopped, questioning the officer's decision to escalate things to this point. Cassandra could feel their eyes on her. She could feel their judgment. Some of them filmed the scene on their phones, and she could almost hear their thoughts. Why is she being treated this way? She wasn't just a black woman being detained. She was someone who had earned a place in this world. She had fought for that respect, for that acknowledgement, and yet it seemed to matter little in that moment. All that mattered was the assumption, the stereotype, the prejudice that Officer Mallory had built up in his mind. Her mind raced, but not with fear. She was never afraid, not now, not with what she knew was coming. She had been through this before, over the years in countless situations where people had tried to minimize her, to deny her humanity. This was just one more instance in a long history of mistreatment, but it wasn't going to be like the others. This time, she wasn't going to let it pass. She wasn't going to let this officer's ignorance go unchecked. As the officer adjusted the cuffs, his hands rough on her wrists, Cassandra stayed silent. She didn't need to say anything. The truth of the situation was already clear, but she knew that it wasn't enough to just endure. She needed to do something, something that would turn the tide, something that would make the officer understand the mistake he had just made. With the cuffs securely in place, Officer Mallory stepped back, his eyes scanning her like she was some criminal, some enemy to be subdued. But Cassandra stood tall, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. The officer was still speaking, still trying to assert his control over the situation, but she was beyond his words now. She was beyond his petty attempts to dominate her. And it was in that moment, as he stood there trying to figure out how to escalate things further, that Cassandra knew it was time to make her move. "I'd like to make a phone call," she said, her voice calm but filled with quiet authority. It wasn't a request this time. It wasn't a plea for understanding. It was a statement of power, a declaration that this moment was about to change, that the situation was about to shift. The officer didn't immediately respond. He looked at her, his brow furrowed, as though he couldn't quite grasp the gravity of what she had just said. He probably thought she was just some woman trying to buy time, trying to delay what he had already decided was her fate. But Cassandra wasn't playing for time. She was playing for control, for the chance to remind him that he wasn't the one holding the power here. The officer hesitated for a moment, perhaps not understanding the implications of her words. He had no idea who she was, who he was dealing with. He had no idea that the moment she said those words, everything was about to change. He probably thought she was just another civilian, just another person to be pushed around, but he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Cassandra wasn't like the others. She wasn't going to be bullied. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without asserting the truth. "I'm going to call someone who will explain to you exactly who I am," she said, her tone steady and sure. She wasn't asking for his permission anymore. She wasn't going to let him continue to treat her like she didn't matter. His authority meant nothing to her now. In that moment, it was the officer who had lost control, and he didn't even know it yet. Officer Mallory's confusion was evident. He muttered something under his breath, not sure how to respond, but Cassandra didn't give him the chance. She wasn't waiting for his approval. She wasn't waiting for him to recognize her rank or her position. She was making a call, an important call, one that would change the course of this entire situation. The officer's grip on her wrists loosened slightly as she reached for her phone, the metal cuff still biting into her skin. But Cassandra didn't care. She was already mentally a few steps ahead, already thinking about the consequences of this officer's actions. The call was short. Just a few words, a name, a number. Cassandra didn't need to explain everything in detail. She didn't need to make a big show of it. All she had to do was make the right call to someone who would immediately recognize her name, someone who would understand the weight of her rank. It wasn't long before the conversation ended, and she hung up the phone, her eyes never leaving the officer. In that moment, she could almost feel the shift in the air. It wasn't just a change in her own demeanor, it was a change in the very fabric of the situation. Officer Mallory's arrogance, his assumption that he had control over this moment, was starting to unravel. And then, as if on cue, a black sedan appeared at the side of the road, its sleek design cutting through the quiet tension like a knife. The car pulled over, its engine purring softly as it came to a stop. A figure emerged from the vehicle, a woman, not in uniform but unmistakably authoritative. Even at a distance, her presence commanded attention, and it was clear that she wasn't just anyone. As she approached, Cassandra recognized the purpose in her every step, the certainty in the way she carried herself. The woman didn't need to say a word to know exactly what was happening. Her eyes locked onto Cassandra's as though they had met before, as if she knew who she was, what she represented. Officer Mallory, clearly taken aback, stood still as the woman walked past him without a glance. She didn't even acknowledge him, as though he wasn't worth her time. Without a word, she reached out, her hand moving with swift precision to unlock the cuffs that bound Cassandra's wrists. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just one smooth, controlled motion that instantly freed Cassandra. The click of the cuffs being released was like the sound of a door unlocking, a symbolic moment of freedom that resonated deeply in the charged atmosphere. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The officer stood there, his face red with confusion and frustration, as the woman who had arrived effortlessly dealt with the cuffs like they were nothing more than an inconvenience. She didn't acknowledge him either. She didn't need to. Instead, she turned to face Officer Mallory, her eyes cool and unflinching. "You detained a 3-star general without verifying her identification," the woman said, her voice steady but forceful. There was no anger, no theatrics, just the calm, quiet authority that resonated in every word. "You violated federal statutes regarding active military personnel." The officer opened his mouth to speak, but she wasn't finished. She cut him off before he could form an excuse. "Do you have any idea what that means?" Mallory stuttered, clearly unable to comprehend the gravity of his mistake. But the woman didn't give him a chance to answer. She raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Stop talking," she commanded, her voice unwavering, cutting through his stammering like a knife. "Every word you say is digging the hole deeper." Cassandra stood quietly, her body relaxed now that the cuffs were gone, but her gaze was fixed firmly on the officer. She didn't need to say anything. The moment spoke for itself. Mallory, still flustered and unsure of what had just happened, seemed to shrink under the weight of his mistake. The woman didn't need to explain who she was, and Cassandra didn't need to say anything more. The officer was beginning to understand the scale of his error. The power had shifted, and there was no way to undo it now. The crowd that had gathered continued to watch, some still filming, others whispering amongst themselves. The tension that had been thick in the air just moments ago began to dissipate as the reality of the situation sunk in. Officer Mallory had overstepped, and there were consequences for his actions. Cassandra wasn't just another woman on the side of the road. She was General Cassandra Ellison, and Officer Mallory was about to learn that the hard way. Officer Mallory stood frozen, his mouth agape, as the woman who had arrived so quietly, so effortlessly, continued to stand with a calm that felt like it could dismantle his entire world. He could hardly comprehend what was happening. A general, a 3-star general. He had handcuffed a high-ranking military officer, someone who had dedicated her life to serving the very country he claimed to protect, and he hadn't even bothered to check her identification. He hadn't even cared. The realization was slowly dawning on him, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no way for him to undo his mistake. He had misjudged her completely, And now, in front of the crowd of onlookers and the woman who stood with such quiet power, there was no escape from the consequences. The woman who had freed Cassandra from her cuffs didn't say another word to Officer Mallory as she turned her gaze from him to the officer's patrol car. She knew that it was over for him, that his arrogance, his inability to see beyond his assumptions, had led him to make a colossal error. But she wasn't finished with him yet. Cassandra could see the shift in the officer's posture as he started to realize the full scope of the mistake he had made. He wasn't the one in control anymore. The power dynamic had completely shifted, and he was now standing at the mercy of a system far bigger than he could have ever anticipated. Cassandra's eyes stayed fixed on him, but there was no anger in her gaze, no frustration. Just the quiet understanding that this was more than just a personal error. It was a reflection of a broken system. The woman who had come to Cassandra's aid finally addressed the officer again, her tone measured but laced with authority. "You didn't just violate military protocol. You violated her rights. You abused your power, and now you're going to have to answer for it." There was no attempt to sugarcoat the situation. There was no room for excuses. Officer Mallory could try to justify his actions all he wanted, but there was nothing that would undo the damage he had caused. The public nature of his mistake, the fact that it had been caught on film, meant that there would be no escaping the consequences. Mallory's face was flushed, his mind racing, trying to piece together an explanation that could save his career, but nothing came. His words were trapped in his throat. For the first time he felt vulnerable, exposed, and it was clear that the woman before him was not someone who could be intimidated or swayed by his typical bluster. She had seen it all before. She had dealt with people like him before, people who thought their authority meant they could control others without consequence. But she wasn't like the others. She didn't let power go unchecked, and she wasn't about to let Mallory get away with this. Officer Mallory started to open his mouth again, but the woman silenced him with a single gesture. "Don't," she said, her voice cutting through his hesitation. "You've already said enough. Your actions speak louder than anything you can say now." Mallory tried to stutter something, but nothing coherent came out. He realized finally that there was no room for words anymore. His actions had already spoken for him, and now they were catching up to him. The woman turned her gaze to Cassandra, her expression softening for the first time since arriving. There was a moment of silence between them, the kind of silence that spoke volumes about respect, about understanding, about the shared experience of women who had fought against the tides of injustice and prejudice. The woman didn't need to say anything to Cassandra. She didn't need to apologize for what had happened or explain her actions. It was clear that Cassandra understood. She knew that the woman was here to ensure that Mallory was held accountable, but also to make sure that this moment wouldn't be the end of the conversation. It was just the beginning. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," the woman finally said, her voice quiet but sincere. "No one should ever have to face this kind of treatment." Cassandra nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on Officer Mallory, who now looked like a man who was facing the inevitable consequences of his arrogance. Cassandra knew that this wasn't just about this one officer. This wasn't about one mistake. It was about the broader issue, the systemic issues that allowed this kind of treatment to go unchecked, the assumptions made based on race, the power imbalances that ran so deep. She had fought for respect her entire life, and yet here she was, having to demand that same respect in a situation where it should have been automatically granted. But as the woman spoke to Officer Mallory, Cassandra realized something. This moment wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about one officer's actions or one officer's downfall. This was about something bigger, something that affected far too many people. The system that allowed this to happen, the system that turned everyday interactions into power struggles based on prejudice, was the real culprit here. It wasn't just Officer Mallory who needed to be held accountable. It was the system that allowed him to make these assumptions, to treat someone like Cassandra with such blatant disrespect. The woman stood, her back straight, her expression hardening again as she faced Mallory once more. "You'll be hearing from the higher-ups," she said, "and I guarantee this is far from over." There was no need for her to elaborate further. Mallory understood. He had no choice but to understand. As the woman turned away from him and walked back toward her vehicle, Cassandra followed her with her eyes, a quiet sense of gratitude settling in her chest. The woman hadn't just stepped in to free her. She had stepped in to make sure that Officer Mallory's actions wouldn't go unnoticed, wouldn't be dismissed. And that meant something. As the woman drove away, Cassandra remained standing on the side of the road, the weight of the moment settling in. Officer Mallory was still standing there, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration, his mind scrambling to catch up with the reality of what had just happened. But Cassandra wasn't interested in him anymore. She wasn't interested in what he thought. What mattered was what came next. What mattered was that this moment, this encounter, would be a catalyst for something bigger than just her, something that could spark change. The air felt different now. The tension that had once been so thick between them had dissolved, replaced by a strange sense of finality. Officer Mallory wasn't in control of this situation anymore, and he would have to live with that. As Cassandra took a slow, deliberate step away from the scene, she knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't over. There would be consequences for him, for the actions he had taken, for the assumptions he had made. But there would also be consequences for the system that allowed him to act this way without thinking twice. In the days that followed, the footage from the traffic stop spread like wildfire. The story of Cassandra's unlawful detainment reached far beyond the local news, gaining traction across the country. The public outrage was palpable, and calls for accountability began to grow louder. Cassandra didn't ask for this attention. She didn't seek to be a symbol of resistance or the face of a movement. But in that moment, she had become exactly that. She wasn't interested in personal vengeance. She wasn't looking for revenge against Officer Mallory. But she was determined to use this moment as a platform for change. She wasn't going to let her experience be a forgotten story. She was going to make sure that people understood the deeper issues at play. As the story gained momentum, legal teams were mobilized, internal investigations were launched, and the pressure on the police department began to mount. Officer Mallory's world crumbled as the truth came to light, as his actions were dissected and analyzed by the public and by the legal system. He had thought he was above reproach, but now he was the face of everything wrong with law enforcement's treatment of people of color. The very system that had allowed him to treat Cassandra with such disregard was now the focus of national scrutiny. But the battle wasn't over yet. For Cassandra, the fight had only just begun. She knew that this moment had the potential to make waves, to spark real change. And she wasn't going to let it go to waste. She would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated, for everyone who had ever been judged based on their race or appearance. The wheels of justice were slowly turning, and Cassandra could feel them grinding forward, gaining momentum. Officer Mallory's mistake was a momentary lapse in judgment, but it would have far-reaching consequences. And as the investigation unfolded, the country would see that this wasn't just a single incident. It was part of a larger, systemic problem that needed to be addressed. And Cassandra Ellison would make sure that people heard the truth.